At 3:28 in the afternoon, on the 27th of September 1964, a white, delta-winged aircraft lifted off the runway at Boscombe Down, Wiltshire, and entered British aviation history through the most cautious door imaginable. The undercarriage stayed down throughout the flight, standard procedure for a first outing on an untested airframe. Speed was held below 250 knots. The aircraft climbed to roughly 10,000 feet. The engines had been derated for that single sortie. The advanced avionics weren't yet installed. The terrain-following radar that would eventually guide it under enemy radar at 200 feet above the ground wasn't on board. The two men inside, Wing Commander Roland Beamont at the controls and Don Bowen in the rear seat, flew for somewhere between 15 and 27 minutes before bringing it home. The IWM film record of that day, catalogue number DEC 31, shows Beamont and Bowen standing next to the aircraft before the flight, examining a piece of paperwork. Final pre-flight checks. They climb aboard. Bowen makes a thumbs-up gesture to the cameraman. The aircraft taxis out. A crowd of engineers and press photographers stands on a grassy bank to watch. Then XR-219 takes to the skies, accompanied by a Lightning chase plane. When it lands and taxis back, both canopies are open. The film ends with Beamont walking back across the dispersal apron, smiling, met by the assembled group. The Guardian's next day edition, 28th of September 1964, described it as this government's last major aeronautical moment. The Conservative government that had commissioned the aircraft was less than 3 weeks from losing an election. The paper knew it. So did everyone at Boscombe Down. What XR-219 represented, even in that deliberately limited first flight, was a machine that Britain had spent 8 years and, by that point, somewhere in the region of £240 million in development costs building. It was the product of a national engineering effort across two of the country's finest aircraft firms, powered by an engine that had required 3 years of extraordinary development work, designed to do something no aircraft in the world had yet demonstrated in operational form. Fly a nuclear strike mission at supersonic speed, 200 feet above the ground, in any weather, to a target 1,000 miles away. 7 months later, the British government cancelled the programme. Not paused it, cancelled it. And within roughly 6 months of that decision, the production jigs and tooling that would have enabled the aircraft to be built in quantity were broken up and scrapped. This is the story of how Britain built something genuinely extraordinary and then, through a combination of treasury alarm, institutional rivalry and political expediency, chose to erase it. The requirement that produced the TSR-2 was made official in November 1956 and circulated to manufacturers in March 1957. General Operational Requirement 339, GOR 339, described an aircraft that didn't exist anywhere in the world. A supersonic all-weather strike and reconnaissance jet capable of delivering nuclear and conventional weapons over a combat radius of 1,000 nautical miles. Operating from runways no longer than 3,000 feet, including semi-prepared surfaces. Flying at Mach 2 or above at altitude, approaching Mach 1 at sea level, at low level initially defined as under 1,000 feet, later tightened to 200 feet. Day, night, all weather. The designation Britain eventually gave it, TSR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance, Mach 2, was a summary of the requirement, not a boast. The strategic logic was tight. The English Electric Canberra, which the new aircraft was meant to replace, had been designed for medium to high altitude. That advantage was already expiring. Soviet surface-to-air missiles were making high-altitude penetration against well-defended targets suicidal. The first aircraft to fall victim to the Soviet S-75 Dvina Sam was a Taiwanese RB-57 in 1959. High altitude was finished as a viable penetration strategy for strike aircraft over defended territory. The Canberra was designed for conditions that had ceased to exist. The solution was to go the other way, low, fast, below the radar horizon, inside the reaction time of ground-based defences. Britain was capable of building what GOR 339 described. That needs to be said clearly, because the later story of cancellation can make it seem as if the ambition was hubristic. It wasn't. English Electric's Canberra had been so successful that the Americans licensed it for domestic production. The Martin B-57, one of very few post-war cases where a British aircraft was built in the United States. The English Electric P-1, which became the Lightning, had exceeded Mach 1.7 by July 1957 and broken Mach 2 by October 1958. The engineers who had achieved that were the same men who would now design the TSR-2. Sir Frederick Page, Freddie, who led much of the supersonic work at English Electric's Wharton facility in Lancashire, later elected a Fellow of the Royal Society for his contributions, was among those who carried GOR 339 from a set of requirements into hardware. The political context in 1957 was already hostile. Defence Minister Duncan Sandys published a white paper that year declaring manned military aviation essentially obsolete, to be replaced by ballistic missiles. Several programmes were cancelled. GOR 339 survived, barely, but it was conceived inside a government that was simultaneously arguing, at ministerial level, that aircraft like the one being specified were already anachronistic. The programme was born with enemies built in. By 1960, the government had pushed the British aircraft industry to consolidate. Vickers Armstrongs at Weybridge in Surrey and English Electric at Wharton in Lancashire, along with Bristol Aircraft and Hunting, were brought together as the British Aircraft Corporation, BAC. The TSR-2 was the new corporation's first and defining military programme. On the 6th of October 1960, a contract for 11 development aircraft was concluded. Serial numbers XR219 through XR227 were allotted for the first 9. The two engineering teams brought different instincts to the work. English Electric concentrated on aerodynamics. Vickers submitted the more detailed airframe design. They were, in the words of one academic analysis of the programme, distinct engineering cultures that didn't merge easily. The internal management friction was real, and it would contribute to the cost problems that followed. Roland Beamont had been English Electric's chief test pilot since 1947. He had flown every significant aircraft the company produced: the Canberra, the P-1, the Lightning. He was proud of being known, as a careful pilot who had never broken an aircraft and had never had to bail out. Those weren't casual boasts. They were a professional record maintained across 15 years of testing experimental aircraft at the edge of what was understood. He would become the TSR-2's primary test pilot and, in one important sense, its most credible witness. During the test program, one of the aircraft's documented technical problems involved a fuel pump vibration that transmitted through the airframe into the cockpit and, in Beamont's case, into his head, with enough force to temporarily blur his vision. He identified it, understood it, and landed the aircraft. That anecdote, preserved in an engineering analysis of the program, says something about both the machine's early problems and the man flying it. The TSR-2's design targets, as opposed to what had been flight tested before cancellation, were extraordinary for 1964. 2 Bristol Olympus 22R engines, designation Mk320, each rated at 30,610 pounds of thrust with reheat engaged. The RAF Museum holds one of these engines. Its collection record states it provided 30,610 pounds thrust, a thrust boost of approximately 50% over dry thrust. Those engines had first run in March 1961, reached 33,000 pounds on a test stand during development, and from February 1962 were being flown in an underslung nacelle beneath Avro Vulcan XA894, demonstrating integration at altitude before the aircraft they were designed for had even been assembled. The designed performance envelope, Mach 2.05 at cruise, between 37,000 and 51,000 feet. Dash capability to Mach 2.35 before leading-edge temperature became a constraint, and approximately Mach 1.1 at 200 feet above the ground for the low-level attack run. Combat radius on a high-low-low-high profile was designed at approximately 1,000 nautical miles, extending to around 1,500 nautical miles with external tanks, and approximately 2,120 nautical miles with a single air-to-air refueling. The avionics suite was its own revolution. Ferranti was developing a dual-channel monopulse terrain-following radar, the first production-intended system of its type in the world. The concept had been pioneered at Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in the United States in the 1950s, but Ferranti was building the hardware intended for an operational aircraft. Initial trials ran on a Dakota. From late 1961, an English Electric Canberra testbed flew with the system at low level. Elliott Automation, which had been awarded the contract for the triplex automatic terrain-following autopilot by late 1960, later recorded that the system worked well in airborne trials. Beyond the terrain-following hardware, the designed navigation and attack suite included a Ferranti inertial platform, Decca Doppler radar for velocity updates, an EMI side-looking airborne radar for ground mapping and position fixes, and a Rank Sintel head-up display. One DTIC technical paper on flight control systems identifies a world first in the TSR-2's flight control system design. The first aircraft to fly with a particular configuration of active control technology. None of this was yet installed in XR219 when Beamont flew it in September 1964. That was entirely normal. You fly the airframe first, establish its basic characteristics, then integrate the systems. The developmental sequence was correct. The aircraft that flew at Boscombe Down was a structural and aerodynamic proof of concept. The full machine, the machine that could do what GOR 339 required, was still being built. The American F-111 program offers the most direct comparison. The Air Ministry had opened a file on the U.S. Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, TFX, in April 1960, 3 months before the formal US requirement was even issued. The subsequent years of comparative analysis gave the F-111 advantages in airfield performance, overall speed, and ferry range. They gave the TSR-2 advantages in navigation and attack avionics. The TSR-2's system used an inertial guidance platform with frequent fixes from forward and sideways-looking radar and a digital computer. The F-111's initial system used external radio navigation aids with an analog computer, which the Air Ministry judged significantly less capable. Air Power Australia's technical profile describes both aircraft as close competitors with broadly similar performance, size, and weight, characterising the TSR-2 as structurally designed to Mach 2+, but aerodynamically capable of higher speeds. They were very close competitors. Britain's version came first. The costs were a genuine problem. Any account of the TSR-2 that doesn't acknowledge this is dishonest, and the aircraft's defenders do it no favours by dismissing the Treasury's concern. Early development estimates had been in the region of £35 million, a number that looks, in retrospect, like something produced in the absence of meaningful data. By March 1962, a Ministry of Defence internal review put development costs at £137 million. By December 1962, estimates had risen to between £175 and £200 million, with unit production cost around £2.1 million per aircraft, and service entry slipping toward late 1967. By mid-1963, the development estimate was £197 to £222 million. By July 1964, it was £240 million in development costs alone, with unit production cost projected at £2.3 to £2.8 million per aircraft. By the point of cancellation, different sources give different totals. Some put the R&D cost written off at around £195 million. Others, using broader accounting, reach £272 million in R&D alone. The difference appears to reflect whether committed but unspent funds were included. Either figure represents a programme whose costs had grown between 6 and 8 times the original estimate. Why had they grown? The honest answer is that the programme demanded things that had never been done before, and the original estimates modelled them as if they were routine. The Olympus 320 engine development was itself a major engineering undertaking. The LP shaft on a Vulcan testbed failed during a full-power ground run at Filton in December 1962, the resulting fire destroying the test aircraft entirely, requiring additional development work. The undercarriage, designed for rough field operations at high weights, had reliability problems that restricted the first 10 test flights to limited envelope exploration. And there was, as one academic study of the programme notes, a structural tendency within the programme to upgrade specifications as development proceeded, with the cost consequences arriving later. In January 1964, Hugh Fraser, the Conservative Secretary of State for Air, wrote to Defence Minister Peter Thornycroft. He said he was appalled. He wrote that the British aircraft industry is destroying our military air power, and that unless cost figures could be drastically reduced, the RAF should seriously consider looking elsewhere. The only alternative I see to the TSR-2 is the American TFX. This was a minister in a Conservative government describing his own country's flagship military aircraft programme in those terms. Cabinet documents from 1964 record rising concern about costs that was visible to ministers across both parties before the election. The TSR-2 arrived at October 1964, already carrying damage inflicted by the government that had commissioned it. Harold Wilson won the October 1964 election with a majority of 4 seats. His government had 3 overriding defence objectives, as the RAF Air Power Review analysis describes. Cap annual defence spending at £2 billion per year by 1969-70, reduce overseas commitments, and reform the British aircraft industry, which Labour believed was consuming more than £250 million per year in R&D money, mostly on military projects, and too many skilled workers who might otherwise be building export goods. Denis Healey became Secretary of State for Defence. One of his first actions was to commission formal comparisons of 3 major British aircraft programmes against American alternatives. TSR-2 against the F-111, the P.1154 VTOL fighter against the F-4 Phantom, the HS.681 transport against the C-130 Hercules. All 3 British programmes were to lose those comparisons and be cancelled, though not all at once. Wilson and Healey went to Washington in December 1964. Robert McNamara, the US Secretary of Defense, reportedly described the TSR-2 in strongly dismissive terms. On the 9th of December 1964, Healy asked McNamara for a price quote on the F-111. McNamara, who had already forced the US Air Force and Navy into a joint program against their own preferences, was a documented and active advocate for the British purchasing American. Whether that advocacy crossed into coercive linkage with British loan facilities or financial support is contested and lacks reliable primary sourcing. What is documented is the timing. On the 1st of April 1965, the same day the British Cabinet met to decide the TSR-2's fate, the US formally offered the UK an option to initially acquire 10 F-111s. Inside the British defence establishment, the politics were more complicated than a clean Labour versus engineering narrative. The RAF's Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Elworthy, agonised throughout January and February 1965 over whether to publicly defend the TSR-2. He had received a paper from within the Air Staff as early as September 1964, cataloguing the outstanding and all-pervading shortcoming of the TSR-2. Its high cost, which results mainly from inept management and an almost total lack of value engineering. Surviving correspondence between Elworthy and his private secretary shows that by the end of March 1965, the balance of Air Staff opinion favoured the F-111, though Elworthy would only commit to endorsing it simply on grounds of cost. TSR-2s were projected to cost approximately £5.8 million each. F-111s were quoted at £2.1 million. That gap was real. The Royal Navy had its own institutional interest. It was pressing for new aircraft carriers, the CVA-01 programme, and arguing, loudly, that carrier-based strike aircraft offered strategic flexibility that land-based aircraft couldn't match. Lord Mountbatten, former First Sea Lord and then Chief of the Defence Staff, was a documented TSR-2 opponent. He reportedly claimed at one point that 5 Buccaneers could be purchased for the price of 1 TSR-2. The RAF Air Power Review notes dryly that the US-built F-111K saw off the Navy's new generation of aircraft carriers in a bitter political battle. But that victory was short-lived. CVA-01 was cancelled in the 1966 Defence White Paper, a year after TSR-2. Both services lost their flagship programmes. The RAF lost first. On the 15th of January 1965, aircraft industry workers marched through London to protest the expected cancellation and defend their jobs. The marchers knew what was coming before the announcement was made. Roy Jenkins, as Minister of Aviation, argued within government for keeping the TSR-2. He lost that argument. The Cabinet met on the 1st of April 1965 and took a unanimous decision to cancel the programme. The date is, in retrospect, a small cruelty. On the 6th of April 1965, James Callaghan stood up in the House of Commons to deliver his budget statement. The framing was austerity. "Our country has suffered from a weak balance of payments for many years," he said, and this budget's purpose was to reduce home import demand by £250 million. The TSR-2 cancellation was embedded in that package, one line among several fiscal measures. The exact words from Hansard, "The decision to cancel the TSR-2 is an earnest of this determination." That sentence ended the programme. Test pilot Jimmy Dell heard it on television during the budget broadcast. All work stopped that day. 6 days earlier, on the 31st of March, XR-219 had completed its 24th test flight, the last TSR-2 flight ever made. The aircraft had flown on 24 sorties over exactly 6 months, from the 27th of September 1964. XR-220, the second airframe, had been scheduled to make its maiden flight around that same date, but had been delayed by minor faults. On the 6th of April 1965, it was still at Boscombe Down. It never flew. Somewhere in Wharton and at Weybridge and across the network of suppliers, the work simply stopped. On the supersonic question, XR-219 had gone supersonic approximately on its 14th flight in February 1965. Accounts of that flight describe the aircraft engaging reheat and temporarily outrunning its Lightning chase aircraft. The Lightning was, at that point, the fastest aircraft in the RAF's inventory. The aircraft that replaced it on the chase was, briefly, behind. That was 4 months before the program ended. What followed the budget announcement is the part of the story that transforms political disappointment into something harder to classify. 9 development airframes had been built, or were in various stages of construction, in the XR-219, XR-227 batch. A pre-production batch, XS-660 through XS-669, was also underway. By Ministry of Aviation order on 24th of June 1965, XR-220 was formally handed to the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment as lying, meaning in its existing condition without any further work. On 6th of July, the Ministry officially terminated the programme and revoked XR-220's certification as a military aircraft. There would be no going back. Within approximately 6 months of the cancellation announcement, the production jigs and tooling at the Vickers BAC site at Brooklands, Weybridge, were scrapped. The equipment capable of building the aircraft in production quantities, the precision tooling designed for volume manufacture from the outset, because the airframes had been constructed on production standard jigs rather than one-off prototype rigs, was broken up and disposed of. The partially completed structures, XR-223, XR-224, XR-225, XR-226, XR-227, and most of the pre-production XS-660 through XS-669 batch were scrapped by a contractor named R.J. Coley & Son at Hounslow in Middlesex. The wooden mock-up at Wharton was transported to the far end of the site and burned. That fire appears in some archival footage. It was the wooden mock-up, not a real airframe. Real airframes were broken up, used as gunnery targets, or, in 2 cases, preserved. None were burned. No signed ministerial order specifically directing the destruction, with the stated purpose of preventing revival, has been found in the primary sources. Dennis Healy gave, in the words of the RAF Historical Society account, an absolute denial that he had given the instruction to destroy all trace of TSR-2. He acknowledged that some jigs had been scrapped to make way for new work. Standard MOD disposal practice was the stated explanation. The intent behind the disposal, vindictive erasure or ordinary bureaucratic clearance, remains genuinely contested. The effect wasn't contested. Within approximately a year, the programme's physical infrastructure was gone. There was nothing to restart. XR-219, the aircraft that had gone supersonic, the aircraft that had outrun a Lightning, the only TSR-2 that ever flew, was sent to the Shoeburyness Weapons Range on 14th of August 1966 for what the documentation describes as vulnerability and lethality trials. It was used as a target. Shoeburyness scrapped it in 1982. 17 years after its last flight, Britain destroyed the only flying TSR-2. XR-221 was delivered to Shoeburyness alongside XR-219 on that same day in August 1966. XR-223 was subsequently sent to the range and scrapped in the early 1970s. 2 aircraft survived. XR-220 was retained after the cancellation for engine noise testing, a mundane technical requirement that kept it intact long enough to be transferred to RAF Henlow and, eventually, to the nascent RAF Museum. It's now preserved at the Royal Air Force Museum Midlands at Cosford, complete in its white anti-flash paint. XR-222 passed through Cranfield University and ended up at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, incomplete but intact enough to show exactly what the machine was. A third survivor of sorts, the T-5 test forebody, the cockpit and forward fuselage section used for canopy jettison and ejection seat trials in 1964, was recovered from an RAE dump in the early 1990s. It's preserved at Brooklands Museum, on the site where some of the tooling was broken up. Those aircraft weren't saved by political intervention. They were saved by the ordinary friction of bureaucratic disposal, things that found a temporary use or ended up in the wrong pile, or that someone kept for engineering tests that delayed their fate long enough for preservation to become possible. The replacement that was supposed to justify everything had its own trajectory. In April 1966, a firm order was placed for 10 F-111K aircraft for the RAF, with options on a further 40. Purchase price, approximately £2.1 million per unit at 1965 prices. By February 1967, the RAF had formally ordered 46 F-111Ks and 4 TF-111K trainers, 50 aircraft total. The first 2 airframes, serial numbers XV-884 and XV-885, began assembly in July 1967 at General Dynamics plant at Fort Worth, Texas. XV-884 completed final assembly by September 1967. XV-885 by December 1967. The rest of the 50 aircraft fleet had serial numbers allocated and components in manufacture. The costs were moving. In May 1967, Dennis Healey told Parliament that per-unit costs had risen by £250,000 to £300,000 above original estimates. The sterling devaluation of November 1967 pushed the per-unit cost from approximately £2.1 million toward £2.7 to £3 million. By early 1968, with British forces east of Suez being wound down, removing one of the primary strategic rationales for the aircraft's range, the arithmetic no longer worked. The F-111K was late. It was over its original price. The strategic requirement it was designed to meet was being withdrawn. On 16th of January 1968, the British government cancelled the F-111K order. Britain paid General Dynamics £46.4 million in cancellation fees. For that money, Britain received nothing. XV-884 and XV-885 were ultimately stripped for components and scrapped. No F-111K ever flew in RAF markings. The RAF ended up with the Buccaneer, the aircraft the Navy had been recommending since before GOR. 339 was issued, the same aircraft the RAF had specifically refused on the grounds that it couldn't meet the required performance. 26 new Buccaneers were ordered, alongside ex-Fleet Air Arm aircraft transferred when carrier aviation was phased out. The Phantom filled the gap elsewhere. The full low-level supersonic strike capability that the TSR-2 had been designed to provide didn't arrive until the Tornado GR-1 entered service in the early 1980s, 15 years after XR-219's last flight. Dennis Healey had told Parliament in May 1967 that the lifetime cost of TSR-2 over 15 years would have been approximately £1,700 million, against approximately £1,000 million for the F-111K, combined with the proposed Anglo-French variable geometry aircraft programme. The Anglo-French AFVG collapsed when France withdrew from the project. The stated saving of £700 million assumed both replacement programmes succeeded. Neither did. The saving was notional. The loss of capability was real and lasted a generation. The Olympus 320 engine that powered XR219 did survive, in a sense. In 1964, Bristol Siddeley began development of the Olympus 593, using the TSR-2's Mk320 as the basis. That engine powered Concorde. By the time Concorde was withdrawn from service in 2003, the Olympus 593 had accumulated millions of flight hours across more than 2 decades of transatlantic service, a substantial portion of them supersonic. The engine Britain cancelled in 1965 powered the aircraft that crossed the Atlantic faster than anyone else for 27 years. The engineers who had built the TSR-2 found other work, some of it on Concorde, some on the collaborative European programmes that Britain joined in the late 1960s and 1970s. The Jaguar, the MRCA that became the Tornado. Some left the country. The specific institutional capability that had produced the TSR-2, the ability to conceive, manage and build a world-leading combat aircraft from a British design without European partnership, didn't survive the decade. The Hawk trainer of the 1970s is often cited as the last all-British military jet to serve with the RAF. What had been one of 3 or 4 world-class military aviation industries in 1957 had, by the mid-1970s, been consolidated, Europeanized, and in several key areas simply abandoned. The TSR-2 story is sometimes presented as a Labour betrayal of British engineering. The record doesn't quite support that framing, and it matters to get this right. Conservative ministers in 1964 were writing internal memos calling the programme's costs catastrophic. The Conservative governments from 1957 onward had presided over the escalation from £35 million to £240 million, without resolving the structural problems. The inter-service rivalry that helped doom the programme was an institutional pathology decades in the making. The tendency to over-specify, under-manage, and then catastrophically write off was systemic, not partisan. But the decision to cancel was taken by the Wilson government. It was announced in Callaghan's budget. It was defended on the basis of a cheaper American alternative that then became more expensive and was itself cancelled. The projected saving depended on assumptions that proved false. The F-111K order, placed to replace the TSR-2, cost Britain £46.4 million in cancellation fees alone, with nothing to show for it. The Tornado that eventually filled the gap didn't reach squadrons until 1982. Within approximately 6 months of the cancellation announcement, the production jigs were gone. Within a year, most of the airframes were either scrapped or designated as gunnery targets. The wooden mock-up was burned. The only aircraft that had flown was sent to be shot at. 2 TSR-2s survive, in museums, because the men who saved them moved faster than the men who ordered them scrapped. Stand in front of XR220 at Cosford today. It's in white anti-flash paint, the livery all the completed airframes wore. The delta wing is enormous in person. The IWM describes the type as one of the most technically advanced aircraft of its day. What that description doesn't convey is that when it was built, that assessment wasn't retrospective, it was current. The aircraft on the museum floor was, at the moment of its cancellation, at or near the leading edge of what could be done. We didn't lose the TSR-2 to the Americans, or to the Russians, or to any aircraft that could outfly it. Nothing could outfly it. We lost it to a decision made in a room by men who never flew it. Subscribe for more stories like this.